Now we're at Sunny Valley. We are continuing through our journey of Deuteronomy. But before that, I want to read, apparently Psalm is the book of the day, right? The Psalms are really powerful. There's a lot of them, and as I was telling Rach, there's a lot of them, so they're meant to be read. So we are going to read through Psalm 143, if you just want to follow along with me, and that's going to kind of set a tone for the message today. So it says this, verse 1, "Hear my prayer, O Lord, listen to my plea. Answer me because you are faithful and righteous. Don't put your servant on trial, for no one is innocent before you. My enemy has chased me. He has knocked me to the ground, forces me to live in darkness like those in the grave. I am losing all hope. I am paralyzed with fear. I remember the days of old. I ponder all your great works and think about what you have done. I lift my hands to you in prayer. I thirst for you as parched land thirsts for rain. Come quickly, Lord, and answer me, for my depression deepens. Don't turn away from me, or I will die. Let me hear of your unfailing love each morning, for I am trusting you. Show me where to walk, for I give myself to you. Rescue me from my enemies, Lord. I run to you to hide me. Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. May your gracious Spirit lead me forward on a firm footing. For the glory of your name, O Lord, preserves my life. Because of your faithfulness, bring me out of this distress. In your unfailing love, silence all my enemies and destroy all my foes, for I am your servant." Cool, Tim. Thanks for starting us off with a heavy, just a heavy psalm. But we're talking about this idea of remembering what God did or remembering God. And I read that for two reasons. One, I believe maybe there's somebody in here who's in the same boat as David was when he was reading that. And so the soul encouragement of you are not alone, our family is here for you, but the Lord, as you see, hears our deepest pleas. I think some of us maybe think there's an untouchableness to God, where if you look through David's Psalms, they're just so transparent and vulnerable. And the second reason I read that is because I think, so we have a friend in our life who sadly just lost somebody in their family, and I know loss is nothing foreign to us here. And you go into a memorial service, right? And what are you doing? You're remembering somebody. You're remembering what they did. You're remembering who they are, and it's past tense because they are gone. And I think sometimes when we think about remembering God, we think about what God has done, and that's great. But the really cool thing about God is that we remember what he did, and we use that as motivation to remember what he is actively doing, and we remember that to motivate us to have hope in what he is going to do. And that plea from David, there's only hope in his voice because he understands that truth about God. I remember what you did, and I'm coming to you because I know what you can do, and I know what you are going to do. So I just wanted to use that as an encouragement as we look into Deuteronomy 8, because Moses he's kind of saying something we've heard a lot in Numbers and Deuteronomy, but there's still a fresh perspective I think we can take in it. So there's something I think we see in almost every movie story arc, right? Who would call themselves a fan of movies? I like movies. You're going to catch me watching a movie once or twice. Okay. I like watching movies. I'm the kind of guy I can throw on a movie I've seen a bit. I'll watch this once a year. I watch this once a month. Maybe I watch this like more than once a month, right? Those are kind of my categories. But we see a pretty consistent story arc, and it's that the main character, they're living in a life that is either filled with turmoil, despair, or just pleasure and comfort, right? So they start there. We catch them in the high life or the low life. Then they go on a journey, right? And they learn things. They discover themselves, often through a hard series of lessons, or I don't think we would watch. Then they come out shinier, brighter, smarter, better, right? That kind of seems to be the story arc. I think of one of my favorite movies, Remember the Titans, right? So it's a school, and they were segregated. There's racism coming around them. They get integrated as a football team. Black and whites come together. They learn about each other. They learn about themselves. They're vulnerable. They become state champs, right? Thank you, Denzel Washington, for saving them. Lord of the Rings, another one of my favorites. You pick a character, honestly. You think of the Hobbits. They are in the comforts of the Shire. They have their safe little routine life. Gandalf comes and just flips that upside down. They journey through Middle-earth to Mount Doom, and after 3 really long movies, there is peace on Earth because the bad guy went bye-bye. Then another Sorenson favorite, Tangled, right? So she's isolated in this tower. It's a story of Rapunzel. Me and Clara were watching this week. It turned out it was more me than Clara, but that's neither here nor there. So she's isolated in her tower, and she has a journey through the woods, and then she becomes the princess. Well, she always was, but she finds that she was the princess of, ironically, Corona is the name of the town. So, again, they all have this story, and I realize if you're looking at this through biblical terms, every story seems to have their Egypt. Every story seems to have their wilderness, where they're going to learn something the hard way. Again, Egypt is what they were delivered from or what they're leaving. And then every story essentially has this promised land, what they are given or they receive. So in chapter 8, Moses is continuing to bang the drum of, you guys have to remember what God has done for you, right? Remember, it's so important. Remember, don't forget. Remember what you were delivered from in Egypt. Remember what God did for you in the wilderness, and remember what he promised you. Those are really powerful things if and only if you remember. And if you're not familiar with Deuteronomy, this is kind of Moses' parting gift. I say that lightly because it's right at the end of this, spoiler alert, that he passes away. So this is his final charge. So the most important things on Moses' mind are now being said to the Israelites, because this is it. It's a pretty long chapter, so I'm just going to use 3 verses to kind of summarize the big gist of chapter 8 before we move on. So verse 1 says, "Be careful to obey all the commands I'm giving you today. Then you will live and multiply, and you will enter and occupy the land that the Lord swore to give your ancestors." Verse 6 says, "Obey the commands of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and fearing him." And then verse 11 says, "But that is the time to be careful. Beware that in your plenty you do not forget the Lord your God and disobey his commands, regulations, and decrees that I am giving you today." All right, cool. Be careful, follow God's instructions. That's it. No problems after that. That is the key to success. Easy peasy. If you guys have any problems, you're doing it wrong. Cool, let's pray. Obviously, it's a little more complicated than that, but today we're going to get inside the shoes, get in the shoes of the Egyptians, and consider why it's important to remember. And we're going to look at those 3 phases, right? We're going to look at the Egypt portion of the journey, the wilderness, and the promised land. Again, if you've been with us, which really cool, Sunny Valley, we're almost we're on the precipice of celebrating a year of being here as a church, which is wild. Yeah, let's clap for that. But if you've been with us, we've been going through some Old Testament books, and you're probably familiar with what Egypt was to the Israelites, the wilderness. Again, there's 40 years of it in the Bible where they're walking through it on this promised land. But we're going to kind of look at why it's important for us to remember those things as well. But I do want to kick it off with the warning. So at the end of chapter 8, he gives them a warning. And just being transparent with you guys, the reason I want to start with this is because I didn't necessarily want to end our service with this whole hey, if you mess up, there's utter destruction, right? I didn't want that being the last thought. But this is important stuff, and we do need to talk about it. So there's 2 verses, 19 and 20, where he says this: "I assure you of this, if you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods, worshiping and bowing down to them, you will certainly be destroyed. Just as the Lord has destroyed other nations in your path, you also will be destroyed if you refuse to obey the Lord your God." So he's really highlighting the power of God. And remember, God just got done telling them, hey, these enemies who are bigger and stronger and potentially better than you, right? I'm handing them over to you. But then Moses is clear and says, but if you disobey what God has said, that power will be used and you will be destroyed. So our first thing is our warning. I don't think there's a spot in your notes, but honestly, they're your notes. Do whatever you want with them. But the warning is that forgetting leads to destruction. Forgetting leads to destruction. In the Old Testament, God was using the Israelites for one purpose, to show everyone who he was. And so you see a lot of very immediate response, struck down, destroyed. So flashing forward to us, I've mentioned this before, but oftentimes as believers, right, our punishment that we receive or that we endure is simply God letting us follow the path that we chose to take away from him. I think God uses the church, he uses a body of believers, encouragement to keep you on the path. But sometimes we are so stubborn, and I'll speak for me specifically, where we're going to walk down that path. Now, if it isn't leading towards God, it is leading towards a path of destruction. And that's harsh for some people to kind of reconcile with. But the fact that there's a path to God in itself is a huge sign of mercy. And I was thinking of like walking on a high wire, right? I saw this video on social media. What the guy was doing, well, one, he was walking on a high wire, right? Just a tiny cable across a canyon. But the dude was like juggling a soccer ball while doing it. Two things I can't do separated. And this guy is out there, and I'm like, are there harnesses? If he falls, right? And it's that idea. You're walking on a high wire. You need to be so focused and ready. If you're half asleep, if you're thinking about something else, apparently not if you're juggling a soccer ball, but you need to be focused on this thing, and you need to be disciplined. I guarantee, well, I can't guarantee this, but if you took 100 people that have never walked on a high wire before, and you said, all right, you got 40 feet across the canyon, I'm not going to tell you what happens if you fall. Don't think there's going to be a huge party on the other side of that canyon, right? You need to be disciplined. You need to know what is going on. And so the same way, this path is narrow, and we need to be focused at all times. Pure science, if you're on a straight high wire across the canyon, and you decide to detour to the right or the left, it's not going to work out for you. There's not going to be a magical road that appears. So this path that leads to destruction, if we're not going towards God, we are going on our own, and that's what is destructive about it. I think of a couple characters or a couple examples in the Bible, Judas and Jonah. I was going to say Judah and Jonas, which those are still names, but Judas, right? So he denied who Jesus was. He was one of his closest people, but he denied in his heart the power of who Jesus was, and he followed his own route, which I believe was this desire for money, right, and getting his own. And that ends up leading to a guilt, which unfortunately led to death for Judas. But then we think of Jonah in the Old Testament. He disagreed with who God was, and that's what I love about Jonah. He had a clear understanding of who God was. He literally yells at him for being so merciful to people who Jonah didn't think needed it, but he disagreed with who God was. So he didn't deny who God was, he just disagreed with him. So he decides to follow his best route. He takes a ship, goes the other way. And it leads him to getting tossed in the ocean. I was thinking about this for a second. I think we can all relate to this in our own lives. Jonah decides to not follow God. Says, God, you're asking me to do that. I'm going to go do this. And it got to a point where the best decision on the list of decisions was for Jonah to say, hey, the best option here is if you throw me into the ocean, that, as the chapter says, was too violent for them to row to land. So he got to a point where that was his only option, was, all right, guys, I'm looking at all my doors. The best one is for you to throw me into a violent ocean. I think we've all been there in our life where we step away from the Lord and we're looking at three options, and it's either bad, terrible, or worse, or there's the repent and go back to the Lord. But a lot of times we want to take that off the table. His best option was, that ocean looks pretty rough. Throw me in there. But that's the one he chose. So we can't forget what God did, and I'm going to say that a lot. So what did God do? Well, to the Israelites, right, there's that deliverance, salvation, and provision. Same thing for us. There's a deliverance from our sin, a salvation, and a provision. So when I say don't forget what God did, that's what I'm talking about. And the cool thing about our church family is that if there's 40 people in this room, there's 40 different really powerful stories of what that looks like in our life. And our goal at some point is to hear every single one of those. So forgetting what God did will lead us to think that we can do it, calling that arrogance. Something else can do it, calling that idolatry. or that it doesn't need to be done in the first place. Call that ignorance. So that one more time, forgetting what God did will lead us to think that we can do it, arrogance, something else can do it, idolatry, or it doesn't need to be done, ignorance. I think we see that in our relationship with God, and we see it in relationships with people, right? You're walking with somebody who's really hurting, and if you don't rely on God to transform their heart, we start to think that we can do it. We start to maybe encourage them that something else can do it, or we don't fix the problem or address the problem at all. So let's look at what this looks like for us in our Egypt, our wilderness, and our promised land. I am going to read a few verses from Deuteronomy once I get to it in my Bible. There we go. We're there. All right. So I'm going to read 11 through 18. All right. It says, but that is the time to be careful. Verse 11, beware that in your plenty you do not forget the Lord your God and disobey his commands, regulations, decrees that I am giving to you today. For when you have become full and prosperous, have built fine homes to live in, and when your flocks and herds have become very large, and your silver and gold have multiplied along with everything else, be careful. Do not become proud at that time and forget the Lord your God, who rescued you from slavery in the land of Egypt. Do not forget that he led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its poisonous snakes and scorpions, where it was so hot and dry. He gave you water from the rock. Verse 16, he fed you with manna in the wilderness, a food unknown to your ancestors. He did this to humble you and test for your own good. He did all this so you would never say to yourself, I have achieved this wealth with my own strength and energy. Remember the Lord your God. He is the one who gives you power to be successful in order to fulfill the covenant he confirmed to your ancestors with an oath. So real quickly, we're just going to look at this idea of what it looks like to remember or forget God in Egypt and the wilderness and in the promised land. So the first one is Egypt, what the Lord has delivered us from. And like I said, 40 different people, 40 different stories. For some of us, there was that comfort, right? It was that self-made, quote-unquote, comfort. For some of us, it was sickness, it was drugs, it was selfishness, it was serving yourself, it was serving someone else. Remember, the Israelites are coming from this bondage of Egypt, right? Serving someone else. So forgetting leads to fear and longing for what never was. This is true for the Israelites. Forgetting what God did leads to a fear and a longing for what never was. Again, if you've been with us, this brings to your mind Numbers 11. They're setting out, the Israelites are setting out from Sinai, like life is good. I remember teaching on this. It builds up the story well. The trumpets are blowing, everyone's following instruction. They're moving out, these huge camps of Israelites. They're stoked. And the Numbers 11 happens, and it says this in verse 1 of Numbers 11. Soon the people began to complain about their hardship, and the Lord heard everything they said. Verse 4 says, then the foreign rabble, which keep that in your pocket as an insult maybe to somebody, you foreign rabble. I'm actually not teaching you guys or encouraging you guys to insult somebody, but it sounded funny. So should have kept that one in the head. Verse 4 says, the foreign rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt. And the people of Israel also began to complain. Oh, for some meat, they exclaimed. And I was thinking about this. It's wild. So we know what Egypt was. It was slavery. There's nothing secret about it. So the Israelites, in their forgetfulness, their bondage became their comfort. And their forgetfulness, their bondage, their slavery became their comfort. It became what they were looking for, right? So they were reminiscing on it because what was ahead of them was hard. They're reminiscing on their days of slavery. Everything was good, right, when the meter was going up, but their first hardship, and they went back to what they knew before God. And I think when we forget what the Lord delivered us from, we're naturally going to respond to what we knew before God. Might be a little stretch of an illustration, but in my opinion, when we forget what God did, we're kind of like the dogs of Proverbs 26:11. It says, as a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool repeats his foolishness. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking of my dog. Now, I have a buddy story, but it's not really a buddy story. It's a buddy lifestyle, right? So a dog, I love him. Rach, you love him? Yeah. Highs and lows. But before Clara, he was one of my best friends. But anyways, I'm going to spare some detail. But I have watched Buddy. I have watched him walk by his food, which is just some yummy kibble, right? I've watched him walk by human food, which is even better, I think, to go investigate his vomit, right? So there's vomit on the floor. He walks by what is literally made for him. He walks by something that's good for him to go to vomit. And I'll just tell you this, when he left, the vomit wasn't there. Cool, we got a little vacuum, but we also have an illustration. And so I think we are no better if we're not leaning on Christ, right? That vomit represents what we did or what we knew before God. And vomit and bile, it has like 2% of it. Might be what it was actually once good food, whatever it was. But it's surrounded by bile and mucus, and I'll stop there so that you guys come back next week. But if we're not leaning on Christ, that's what we go to. That's what we were familiar with. We pass by. We don't even regard other things because the scent is so pungent and it attracts my dog who loves to smell things, and that's what he goes to. Again, there's maybe something good in there that didn't get digested, but it's not the best for him. We pass by and we forget what the Lord has given us. So, away from dog vomit for now. Can't promise I won't be back. Remembering what God did, though, leads to thankfulness and redemption. Again, the Psalms where David is just shouting in thankfulness. And what I love is that he's so transparent, right? And this is my hope for all of us. And I've had conversations with this before about kind of that transparency of our flaws or of our past, right? And ultimately, if it is glorifying how the Lord has transformed you, it is awesome. But the moment we start to boast in our folly for our sake, that's where it gets weird. Something we should never do in the first place. But he gladly shares where he was throughout a lot of the Psalms. He's like, man, I was this, I was that, I was terrible, but, and there's always a but the Lord has delivered me. And we become transparent, right? Because we are in our new self. And so we're talking about that old self because that's not who we are anymore. So when we remember what God did for us, we live in a life of thankfulness, transparency, and redemption. So the second one, the wilderness, right? What the Lord is teaching us. And I think this is where a lot of us, we're still obviously being taught right now, but it's where God is trying to show us who he is, and it's where we get to learn about him and unfortunately who we are as well, which that's where a lot of the tough lessons come from. So forgetting leads to complaining and arrogance. Now in verse 12 it says, for when you have become full and prosperous and built fine homes to live in, when your flocks and herds have become very large and your silver and gold have multiplied along with everything else, be careful, do not become proud at the time and forget the Lord your God who rescued you from slavery. It's like Moses knew about America before we did, right? When you become proud and when you build things, don't forget. Don't think you did it. Complaining probably defines the beginning of the Israelites' journey as we saw in the book of Numbers, right? That's what it always was. They were complaining because they forgot what the Lord was trying to teach them. I'm not going to spend time on that one telling you another dog story. I want to go right to the remembering, though. The remembering, because this is fun. This is exciting to me. It leads to trust in God's provision and faith in his work. Now, I'm saying that really easily, but this is a hard one. This is the one that's going to might take some of us more than 40 years, right? But when we remember what the Lord is teaching us and what he did for us, this is going to lead to trust in God's provision and faith in his work. Not to say that it's not going to be hard, but what I think this will lead us to, and I want to be careful and say this isn't like guaranteed is that life's going to be great, but I think as we really start to intentionalize, we're following that high wire and we know what God did and we know what he's trying to teach us and we know that he's there, we become excited in the unknown. We look for opportunities to step out in faith. We look for opportunities to invite others into that life. Again, we become excited in the unknown. We look for opportunities to step out in faith, and we invite others into this life. So I will boldly say that when we see what the Lord's doing on the high wire, there's going to be something stirred up, transformed in us to where we will invite people and say, hey, this high wire, this is a journey. This is one I want you to go on with me. But be careful. This has been one of the more radical things to me, I think, in the last year, and this will kind of lead into the next one as well. But I think, oftentimes in hindsight, because I'm not really ready and prepared to learn right when he's trying to teach me, but in my stress, the Lord has taught me to have peace. In my victories or in my pride, right, he's taught me humility. That one really got hit when I met Rachel, right? I had this cool, puffy version of myself. And then comes this girl who I fall in love with, and the Lord used her to teach me a lot of things I needed to be taught. My prideful self didn't like those, but the person who I am now was very humbled and excited. So he will continue to, as we ask him, examine my heart. He's going to examine the heart, and he's going to teach us those things. We just have to be willing. But we become excited in the unknown. And I'm gonna pause that. I'm gonna get to that one in just a second as we go to the third one, this promised land, right? Remembering what the Lord has promised you, what he has given us. The forgetting leads to complacency and self-sufficiency, right? More grumbling. The little pedestal, the little soapbox I want to stand on is this idea of I think when we forget what the Lord has given us, you naturally are going to think, who gave it to you? You, right? We think we did it. And there's this the term that was in my head is this idea of a self-made king. And I think our country, specifically in the realm of sports and fame, we're big on that, right? So I'm a big sports guy. I love watching sports, but I can't deny the fact that there are gifted athletes out there who at 10 and 11 years old are being told and are telling themselves that they are kings of the world because they can play a sport better than a lot of other people. And they're being given a lot of money to do it at a younger age. So there's no wonder that there's this culture that has these people being raised to this pedestal that they are kings and queens, gods among all. And that leaves a lot of other people to want to strive to do that as well. So we have all these people that are now trying to become kings on their own or queens and famous, completely forgetting what the Lord has provided us in the first place. And then if you are at a comfortable spot, again, it's really easy to sit back and say, wow, look what I did. I mean, we probably all have caught ourselves. I know there's there's a lot of handy people in this room, and you guys probably have a lot of really cool things that you have built in your past, and it could be really easy to look back and be like, wow, look what I did. It's been really humbling having a 2-year-old because I still will sit there with Rachel and be like, we have a 2-year-old and we're really proud of who we are, but because of the humbling nature of a toddler, the idea of look what I did is out the window, and it's like, wow, God actually we survived because of God. This little 2-year-old ate our lunch day after day after day, but we're here. Thank you, Lord. But it's still tempting to look at our life and be like, wow, we did it. We didn't do anything, right? The Lord has given it to us. He's given us community. Sure, we've put effort in, we've invested into things in our community, but forgetting that the Lord's hand is in everything will lead to complacency and self-sufficiency. And those ultimately are just paths to destruction. But remembering leads to a peace in God's provision or gratitude. And I want to get back. I think Sunny Valley in our life has been huge, and I hope in your guys' life as well. This idea, like I said, this having a peace in the unknown, right? So I don't know what's going to happen next, but I've said this so much, but the Lord's in it, and that's all I really need to know, right? 2 years ago, I didn't know that I would be here. It wasn't even on my list of doors or options. Or when Michelle drove by here, right, she didn't know what was going to be made of this property, but she knew the Lord told her to do something. And so obeying the Lord just led to this very obvious provision of what God is doing. So I've served in the ministry as an associate, right? As a number 2, as a helper. Now we're getting to this role. And I'm like, all right, well, what's it look like to be a pastor of a church? God said, Tim, you can do nothing. So just sit back and let me kind of work. Let me do what I'm doing. You just get out of the way when you're supposed to, talk, crack a joke when you're supposed to, right? Close your mouth, right? So, and in that, there's a lot of these questions. So the next one that Rach and I are asking is what it looks like to move out here in this area. We live in Grants Pass right now. But there's this piece that wouldn't have been in Tim's heart 5 years ago. It said, I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I know that if it's of the Lord, it's going to happen. And that just literally gets me excited, right? Like, because I have found, and I pray that, I remember that what God does, way cooler than what Tim does, right? If Tim needed to provide a place out here, we're going to have a cardboard box. Great in the summer, Claire can run around, right? But if we wait on what the Lord can do, he's going to provide with exactly what he wanted to. And when we scour the New Testament, we just see the provision of God all over it. We see that he is always with us. Hebrews 13:5, I will never fail you. I will never abandon you. Those are really powerful words. I will never fail you. I will never abandon you. We see that he's already given us everything we need. Philippians 4 says, the same God who takes care of me will supply all your needs from his glorious riches, which we have been given to us in Christ Jesus. We see in Matthew 7 that we have the ability to ask for anything, right? Matthew 7:7, keep on asking, you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, you will find. Keep on knocking, the door will be opened. But then again, a verse that I've used before and I will use again, Matthew 11, that he extends an invitation for us to find our rest in him. And I think that's where I get excited. Come to me, all you who are weary, carry your heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. So when we remember, we get peace in God's provision. Not that it's always going to be easy, but there's this peace. All right, he's not saying the road stops getting tough. He just says, I'm with you, and I got you during this road. So I want to ask the worship team to come back up, and as we close, I want us to use this time in our hearts to remember, right? It'd be silly for me not to encourage you to do that. And they're going to sing this song, and the song's called Promises. I think it's a new one out here, but if you listen to K-Love or Air One, there's a good chance maybe you've heard it. And there's the chorus here. It says this, great is your faithfulness to me, great is your faithfulness to me. From the rising sun to the setting same, I will praise your name. Great is your faithfulness. So whether you want to sing along or you just want to close your eyes and let them sing the song over you, I want us to think about that in our lives, right? I don't want us to get caught up in the music of it all or the cool words, but great is God's faithfulness to us. So what does God's faithfulness look like in our lives? Again, 40 different people, 40 really cool stories. Let's pray.